It was the most unusual job that I'd ever had. And it all started when the cable giant Mediacom trespassed on a farmer's property. They wanted to cut across a corner of his field in order to string their fiber optic cable, and so they took down the fence, they put up their pole, they went back out and repaired the fence, all without asking permission. And when the farmer discovered what they were doing, he complained, and the Mediacom representative said, well, we really need to do this. What about $300 for your trouble? And the farmer thought, well, that's a great $300. They shook on it, and it was all fine until Mediacom reneged on their agreement. And that old Missouri farmer wasn't going to have any of that. And that's when he reached out to my friend Farrell. Farrell was a lawyer, and he just was curious how many other pieces of property had been trespassed upon as they were stringing up this cable. And he found out that there were a lot, and that's when he hired me. And so for about 6 months, I drove the back roads of Missouri looking at all those different incidents where Mediacom had crossed over into somebody else's property. 1,000 miles of cable I got to track down, and I found out that there were over 300 incidents of trespass. And that started a class action lawsuit. And long story short, that David and Goliath kind of lawsuit ended up in favor of the property owners, and it cost considerably more than $300 for Mediacom to settle their trespasses. I got to collect evidence. Have you ever had to collect evidence and figure out how things all fit together? For most of us, we think about evidence as documenting offenses. The supervisor for my first job certainly thought this way. Janet wasn't popular with her employees. They grumbled and they dragged their feet. One was openly defiant of her, and so her assignment to me as a new person working there in the library is that every time I came across an error, I needed to document it. And not knowing any better, I just did what my supervisor told me to do until she had enough evidence to fire that thorn in her side. It took a couple of years and a lot of growing up and working with others before I realized that there were better ways to work together. That when we keep track of people's errors, we aren't very good at building their strengths. Are you ever tempted to keep a record of wrongs when it comes to your spouse or to your co-workers? Do you ever keep a record of the wrongs that maybe God has done toward you? Every now and then I run into somebody who wants to blame God for all the wrongful things that have come into their life. They are building a case against God instead of believing that He loves them and is for them. They somehow have it in their mind that God wants to just harm them, and they're not willing to listen to any other perspective. When most people collect evidence, they tend to focus on what's wrong. They try to justify their lack of support or to explain away their ungodly behavior toward the people they see as their enemies. Fortunately, there's a growing trend where people gather evidence to celebrate the strengths in others. I saw this at my daughter's 5th grade award ceremony. The principal recognized the students with the best grades, but they also gave out awards for perfect attendance and most improved and the kindest person in the class. There was even an award for the funniest person in the class. The administration challenged the teachers to find something praiseworthy in each of their students, to look for evidence of that person's growth as a person. We see this award kind of mindset with the Employee of the Month pictures and special parking places, with the Mother of the Year awards. I deeply appreciate the card writers in our church because when you see somebody doing something good, you write down a note and you send it, and God works through you to be an encouragement to so many others. Are you the kind of person who looks for reason to praise others? Someone who collects evidence of a life that's well lived? As we move through the service today, I encourage you to think about a person that you could encourage. And as I'm preaching, just kind of make a list of all the different ways that God has worked through that person to improve the lives of others. I start the service today with this issue of evidence because it helps us to answer the question, why? Why does God allow hardship, these faith-threatening events to shadow our life? And how do we overcome the disappointment that comes when God fails to do what we really need Him to do? Over the last several weeks, we've talked about the quiet disappointments that undermine our confidence in God. Disappointment comes when our experience doesn't match our expectations. So we started by examining our expectations of God. Is God failing to live up to what he said that he would do, or is God being faithful to what he said that he would do? And we realized that in almost every situation, God is, not in every, almost, in every situation, God is faithful to what he said he would be and what he said that he would do. It isn't that God isn't doing what he said. We need to adjust our expectations and allow him to be who he really claims to be. We also looked at the hard to answer questions that undermine our faith. The question of, is God fair? Does he treat everyone the same? And the answer is that God gives sufficient grace to everyone, the help we need to believe and to grow and to survive those hard things of life. Any additional blessings are an equipping from God that provides us with the help we need to serve him more effectively. We asked, is God silent? What are we to do when God doesn't answer our questions? And we saw that God's seeming silences are actually ways that he tests our faith and helps to mature our faith in him. We also acknowledge that God is never truly silent. He's always speaking to us through creation and through the Bible, through the testimony of spiritually mature friends and the quiet witness of the Holy Spirit. And I hope you've taken these first several weeks of the new year to listen a little bit more carefully to God and to allow him to speak more deeply into your life. The hardest question for me has to do with the times when God is hidden, when he doesn't explain himself. We saw last week through Hebrews 11 that God challenges us to test his love for us and his goodness and devotion to us, to test that early in our relationship with him so that we learn to trust his heart during those times when he doesn't explain himself. I hope this series has helped you as much as it's helping me. God doesn't want us to live with our disappointment. If we ask, he'll help us to spiritually grow through our experiences that would otherwise weaken our faith. But there's one more question we need to answer. One more insight we need to gain into the heart of God. And it comes back to the issue of, why does God allow hardship? Why doesn't he just return in his glory and start over with that new heaven and earth that he has promised? And the answer has to do with evidence. So go ahead and turn to the book of Job, chapter 1. We're going to return to where we started with this series. You'll remember that Job was a righteous man who honored God and shunned evil. God was pleased with Job. He held Job up as an example of all that was best in humanity. Satan, however, decided to challenge God's assertion. Satan claimed that Job worshipped God because God protected and prospered Job. Job 1:11 records the conversation where Satan said, "But stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and surely he will curse you to your face." So do you have the picture in mind? God is seated on the heavenly throne, speaking with his heavenly counsel about the good that was in the world. And then Satan enters the scene with the accusation of divine intervention, with the suggestion that God was lying and when he was praising the goodness and the faithfulness of Job. Satan, literally means the accuser of the brethren. In this situation, he took upon himself the role of the prosecuting attorney. But he wasn't prosecuting Job. The person that Satan was trying to prosecute was God himself. And God was essentially saying, no one will voluntarily submit to the authority of God. People only worship or obey God because God rewards good behavior. And so what do you think? Is Satan right? Do we only worship and obey because God blesses us, bribes us with the hope of heaven? Or is God right? Is it reasonable for God to believe that people will love and serve God just because God is good? This wasn't an idle question for Satan. You remember that Satan was once the prince of angels, second only to God in his power and authority. Isaiah 14 explains where Satan went wrong. You see, Satan wasn't content with a submissive role. He wanted to establish his own throne, to have an authority that was separate from the authority of God. And so Satan showed by his words and his actions that he didn't believe that beings of free will would ever voluntarily submit to God. And so on that long ago day, when God was pointing to Job as an example of what is right and good in the world, Satan challenged God. He called God a liar and essentially said, "You are wrong to assume that I or anyone else would submit to you, that I or anyone else would genuinely love you." Job was the evidence that Satan chose to put before the heavenly council. He said, "Withdraw your protection and see if Job still worships." In Job 2:4, he said, "Let me physically afflict Job and he'll curse you to your face." And so God allowed the testing of Job, hoping that Job would show himself to be faithful. God allowed a similar testing with Jesus. In Matthew chapter 4 and Luke chapter 4, it records the temptation of Jesus. After spending 40 days praying and fasting, at a time when Jesus was physically and emotionally depleted, Satan tested Jesus. Have you ever noticed how that tends to happen? When we are at our weakest is when we face our greatest tests. And so Satan portrayed God as being unreasonable in his expectations of Jesus. The first test had to do with turning stones into bread, and Satan simply said, "God has given you all this power, Jesus. Why don't you just take a little bit of that power and feed yourself, meet your own need?" He went out from there and said, "There's an easy way to gain the support of the people, Jesus. Just jump off the tower right here at the temple. Perform a miracle in the presence of all these people, and they'll follow wherever you want to lead. Jesus, you don't have to die to become king of this world. I'll give you this world if you'll simply agree with me. Bow to me instead of God, and you can have this world without a fight." Like Job, Jesus chose to worship God, to obey God. Jesus trusted God with all of his hardships and betrayals and his physical pain, and even with his death. And like Job, Jesus became evidence for God, proof that God could trust at least some people to put their hope in him. But that just leads me to ask, what kind of evidence are you and I becoming? I wish that Job and Jesus were isolated examples. Unfortunately for us, Satan is still trying to prove his point. He's still claiming that it's unreasonable of God to expect that anyone of free will would voluntarily submit to him or genuinely love him. And God still allows Satan the freedom to push our normal hardships and our normal griefs to a spiritually destructive end. I use the word normal on purpose. God has promised to put limits on how far Satan can push us. 1 Corinthians 10:13 assures us that we will only be tempted with the kinds of things that other people have faced and overcome. That when the test is too great, that God will make a way of escape so that we won't be crushed by the wrongness in our life. God allows the testing because Satan has a point. How will we know that our love for God or our submission to God is genuine and not just a shallow response to God's many blessings? And how can our faith mature? How can our love for God become unconditional unless it's threatened? Unless we have to choose to trust God in spite of our circumstances? One of the most powerful explanations of love that I've ever heard came from a woman who had abandoned her family. The stress of being a mother of 2 young children became too much, and so Jane decided to drop them off at the babysitter, and she packed a bag and left a note saying that it's too hard, I can't do this anymore. Her husband picked the kids up later that day and got the food on the table and got the children down to bed, and then he called his wife and talked about the day and how much he loved her and how much he wanted her to come home. He was just hoping that a little bit of time by herself would have kind of set things to right. But she said, "I love you and I love you the children, but I really can't do this anymore." And she just hung up. And that became a nightly ritual. Tom would call his wife to make sure that she was all right and talk about the kids. And he always ended the conversation, "I love you and I want you to come home." And she would simply say, "I can't," before she would hang up that phone. Tom knew that he was losing her. Fearing another rejection and not knowing what else to do, Tom hired a detective to track down his wife. He was given a room number in a pay-by-the-week kind of hotel, and so with flowers in hand and a carefully rehearsed speech, Tom knocked on the door. But before I could say anything, Jane just saw him and threw her arms around him and tearfully asked, "Can we go home now?" And a week or so later, when the emotions had settled down, Tom asked, "Why didn't you come home before? Why did you wait for me to knock on your door?" And Jane explained that first night I realized that I'd made a terrible mistake. I was so ashamed of myself that I just couldn't come home, and I couldn't believe that you still loved me or even wanted me to come home. And so I kept hearing you say, "Come," but I just didn't believe it in my heart until you were there right before me. And I knew that you really wanted me, that you really forgave me, and I knew that you really loved me in spite of what I had done. And that's when I was able to come home. Overcoming the threat to their relationship changed the way this couple related to each other. It proved Tom's devotion to Jane, his genuine love and forgiveness, but it also taught Tom what it means to love unconditionally, to have the kind of devotion that doesn't give up. The Apostle Paul tried to explain the function of tests, these crises of faith that are allowed into our lives. And this is what he said in 1 Peter 1:3. He said, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade, kept in heaven for you, who through faith are shielded by God's power until the coming of the salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last time. In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials." And if you ever had to suffer grief in all kinds of different ways? "These have come so that your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by the fire, may be proved genuine and may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed." Friends, God allows the testing of our faith to be tested even by the fires of this world, not because he delights in pain. We see through the story of Lazarus' death that Jesus actually weeps with us when we are grieving. No, God allows the testing of our faith because he wants that faith to be purified so that we can receive the fullness of his praise, glory, and honor. The quality of our love, the nature of our relationship with God matters to God. Now, I don't believe for a minute that God brings the pain. Pain is the fruit of ours and other people's sins. It's the consequence of this corrupted world. God doesn't bring the pain or the hardship, but he doesn't protect us from the disappointments either. When the circumstances of life force us to choose between trusting God and turning away from God, all of heaven holds its breath to see what we'll do. Will we embrace our calling to sonship, to life with God? Or will we agree with Satan and say that God doesn't deserve my unconditional love or trust? He isn't worthy of my faithfulness. Understanding what's going on in the heavenly realm changes the way that I view the struggles in this earthly realm. Choosing to love our spouse or children or even the difficult person sitting across the room from you. It's one of the ways that I say, I love you to God. And the harder it is to forgive, or the harder it is to embrace, the harder it is to work with somebody, the greater the potential victory in the heavenly realm. Think about that, friends. All of us have people that we have a hard time getting along with. All of us have people who have a hard time forgiving. But when we choose to do what God has asked us to do, there is not just a victory in our life, but there's a victory in the very halls of heaven. Choosing to serve the homeless, or to visit the imprisoned, or to befriend our neighbors, including the people who look and sound different from us. These are ways we submit to God, ways we join God in bringing his good into the world. And the harder it is to serve alongside of God, the more we have to grow and the more we have to adjust, the more we become like Jesus. And again, there's another victory in heaven itself. Some of you don't believe that your life matters. You're too sick or too old or too broken. Satan has almost convinced you to curse God and die. Your determination to worship and to serve and to struggle on is a victory that condemns Satan. It's the evidence that proves that God really is worthy of our obedience and our trust and our love. Your life and your faith matter to God. And that's why Satan is trying to destroy you, to tear apart your family and our church, to nullify our influence in the world. The Apostle Paul explained it this way in Ephesians 6:10. He said, "Finally, my brothers, be strong in the Lord and in His mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the power of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand." We'll talk more about the armor of God when we can take time to go deeper. But for now, I just want us to understand that there's more going on in your life than just the physical. There really is an enemy who wants to stir your doubts and to inflame your desires and to fill you with fear. He wants to push your normal disagreement to the most destructive end. We have to be wise. We have to be prepared if we're to become the kind of people that God holds up as trophies of His grace, as evidence that life with Him is worth the living. We're going to close this morning with communion, with a reminder of the evidence that God has given us of His wholehearted devotion to us. But as the ushers approach to prepare the elements, I just want to share this final story. Once there was an earthquake that shook a small Japanese seaside village. Earthquakes are quite common in Japan, and so once the ground had stopped shifting and none of the buildings had fallen down, the people just went back to work. But there's an old farmer who was watching from his home on top of the plain above the village. He looked out at the sea and he noticed that the water was no longer moving with the wind, but is moving out to sea, and he had seen that before. He recognized what was happening. He realized that a great wall of water, a tsunami, was about to fall upon his village. But he didn't know how to attract the attention of his friends and family. He didn't know how to get them to move from where they were, higher ground, to where they would be safe. And as he was looking around, trying to figure out what to do, he noticed all the bales of the freshly harvested rice. It was worth a fortune. Everything that his family had was poured into that crop. But without hesitation, he called to his grandson, "Go and get a torch." And he took that torch and he began to go from bale to bale, lighting all of that rice on fire. And it wasn't long until the bell in the temple below began to ring, calling the people to put out the fire. And everyone, from the youngest to the oldest, began to make their way up, wanting to help their neighbor to stop this fire and to save his harvest. But as they got up there, they didn't see him trying to beat out the fire. They simply saw him standing there looking out to sea. And as the people crested that hill and they began to turn to look at what he was looking at, they saw that line in the water beginning to make its way toward the village. And that great wall of water slammed into the village, and it went out to sea, and it slammed again and again until finally it slammed that last time, and the waters returned to normal. On the plain, no one spoke for a long time. And finally, the voice of that old man could be heard softly saying, "That's why I set rice. That's why I set fire to the rice. There was no other way to get your attention." The old man gave evidence that day of who and what was most important to him. On our day of testing, and for many of you it's more than just a day, it's a season of life where the testing just doesn't seem like it's going to stop. But when God allows Satan to touch our life and to stir our fears and to push us to those self-destructive places, what kind of evidence will you and will we together give? And how will our choices shape the kind of person that we are becoming? How we respond to our disappointments and our crisis of faith that matters to God. because you matter to God, because you and your love are precious